Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Burge, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show.
My name is Dr. Marshawn Hyman, and I'm the co-founder and principal consultant of True Change Alliance, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. If you haven't heard of TCA, we sponsor the DARE series on the Music Ed Matters podcast. Today, I'm excited to set the stage for the Music Ed Matters podcast Black History Month series. The overarching purpose of Black History Month is to acknowledge and honor the contributions of Black Americans. As you hear the guests over the next month, I ask that you make room for a different perspective and hold space for new understandings. Additionally, I invite you to explore a paradigm shift where we define Black history not as the history of Black people, but as American history told through the lens of Black people. This notion suggests that Black history is not an other or something that we pause to engage in for the month of February, but a way to sharpen our understanding of the American experience. So while Black History Month is every month, this month we unapologetically celebrate Blackness and uplift the voices of Black professionals, educators, and musicians. Outside of listening to this podcast, I encourage you to actively celebrate as well. To celebrate Black History Month, you should learn, engage, and act. Learn about the history of Black people in America, engage with those outside your circle, and support events in your area, and act by supporting Black businesses and donating to organizations working to advance racial justice in this country. Enjoy the series.
Hello, and welcome to episode 92 of the Music Ed Matters podcast. As you heard from Dr. Hyman, this is part of our Black History Month curated series, and I can't wait for you to hear from Mr. Arreon Harley-Emerson. This episode is worth every second. Make sure you have something to take notes on because you are about to learn so many things. Mr. Harley-Emerson takes us through cultural scaffolding, the gang mentality of choir. We talk about Maslow, we talk about connectivity and the social power of all sorts of things choir, but then we talk about not choir stuff and leadership. And wait till you hear his definition of leadership, y'all. Holy smokes. You will walk away from this episode with actionable items to employ ADEIBR and what that stands for. I can't wait to hear what you think. This episode is not only part of our Black History Month, it's brought to you by our friends at Kaleidoscope Adventures and the Kinnison Choral Company. Y'all, it's days like today recording this episode that I pinch myself that we get to have this platform together. Thank you so much for listening to the Music Ed Matters podcast, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Mr. Arreon Harley-Emerson. Today, on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we're talking to Mr. Arreon Harley-Emerson. Hello, my friend.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so excited to speak with you today. How's Delaware?
Delaware is great. Delaware is great, yes. So I technically live over the line. I've moved to the dark side in Pennsylvania when I got married. But pretty much my entire life and my social circles and professional circles, everything is pretty much in Delaware. So I still claim to be a Delawarean. And Delaware is as fabulous as it has always been.
It is a beautiful state. I'm so excited that we get to have these conversations thanks to Zoom. Will you tell us your story? How did you get into music? What path led you to Delaware?
Yeah.
How did you become the director of operations and music? Just tell us everything.
Yeah. I don't have one of those straight line trajectory stories like who does these days, right? So I grew up. As a kid, I was singing all the time. There are like little videos and pictures of me conducting in my crib. So obviously I was born to be a conductor.
Do you have these? Can we see these?
Oh yeah, I will follow up. With some things and folks can take a look at them. My mom has them. I'll have them dig some stuff up. But I was just always like a musical kid. We went to church from what I like to say Sunday to Sunday, meaning we were there every day. It was one of those like really intense kind of church programs where it was like all day Sunday. Then there was like youth group on Monday, Bible study on Tuesday, midweek Wednesday service, Thursday choir rehearsal, Friday, youth night, Saturday, clean up the church day, and back to Sunday. That was my experience. And then, of course, the Black church music is really a big part of that. The praise and worship chunk was always actually longer than the sermon, right? It's like its own kind of piece. And so that was really my first experience musicking. And for a long time, I kind of discounted that as like, oh, that's not really like a, musical experience. But I'm like, no, that was like really formative to who I am and was great learning. And, I'm really struggling because, we would call that technically informal learning, that we have these terms, formal and informal learning, and I'm like, I think that's kind of diminutive of those learning experiences. Anyway, that's where I started. And then I guess my formal, if we're using those terms, learning came through my elementary school. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And my elementary school teacher, Mr. McCoy, shout out to him, he was the best. And he was like, man, you're like really, really like, a talented singer. And like, even though you're only in second grade, like we would love to have you sing with the 4 and 5 choir. And I was like, what? That's amazing. And I did that. And he was running all these fun music programs. I remember things on like very early music software. Like this was like a long time ago, before like, Finale and Sabele. Like it was like something that he was using. And I remember him being really into Orff, and he was just the best music teacher. And one day he sent me home with a letter. And he was like, take it home to your mom. I was in the free mom. I was like, okay, whatever. I sent it to, I took it home to my mom. It was a letter. It was a flyer to audition for the Peabody Children's Chorus in Baltimore, still conducted by Doreen Falvey. And he had written a handwritten note on the back of it, which I still have, which was just like, Arreon is like really talented. I think you should really consider auditioning for this. I would personally like to offer preparing him for this audition. Blah, 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 blah. Please give me a call. Let's chat. I'll keep following up with you. And I was like, I don't know. And he kept following up with my mom, and my mom and he had some conversations, and I started getting ready for the audition. And then I joined the Peabody Children's Chorus, and that was that. And at age 7, I got involved, and I was involved with that all the way through my senior year of high school, because I even did interning there as well, in college and in high school. So it was really formative for me. And I remember just the first rehearsal, hearing one of the advanced groups singing the Hans Leo Hassler Cantate Domino. And I had just never heard music like that before. And there's that like polyphonic section in the middle. And I was just like, what? I just had never heard anything like it. And I just was enamored. I could not believe that this was something I had never heard before. It was like, I had never been able to see or taste or touch. It was like another sense of mine was opened on that day. And it was just amazing. And then, I went off to college. I graduated from Goucher College. I actually was like burnt out from music, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to do music. I'm going to be a creative writing major and all this stuff like that. And then there was like a music scholarship, and I was like, oh, I'll apply. And it was like, you have to be at least a major. And I was like, oh, okay. At least a minor. And I was like, okay, I'll be at least a minor. And then I was like, no, actually, I'm going to do this thing. And I was a double major in music composition and of a performance. And then I was, at an ACDA performance, I heard the University of Delaware Choral perform, and I was like, that's where I'm going for grad school. And I, auditioned, at a lot of places, and I just was like, but I really want to go to Delaware, because I've never stepped foot in Delaware, and that choir from Delaware was really great. And so I went there for grad school. So I did my first master's in choral conducting. Then I came back and I did one in voice. All at the same time, I was teaching in the school district of Philadelphia, which is wild and crazy. Yes. So I loved that. It was an amazing experience. And then from the school district of Philadelphia, I was recruited to the choir school. So I didn't really seek it out. It found me. There was a teacher who was doing a practicum experience, and for some reason or other, needed to come with me because of some changes in placements and things like that at the University of Delaware. And so she was coming to me, with me to school in Philadelphia. And she was like, oh, I'm like a section leader at this thing and I mentor at this thing called the Choir School. It's really cool. You should hear about it. You should come check it out. And I was like, oh, I will. And I never did because I was just too busy. And then she was like, oh, there's an opening. They're hiring someone. Da, 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 da. And they were like, oh, you would be great. And I was like, oh, no, like, absolutely not. Like, they had an amazing director, and they were all not only great choral conductors, but like virtuoso organists. Like the director before me was from New Zealand and was like this, like, just brilliant organist, and like these just great, like, really accomplished sacred music folks. And I was like, oh, I don't know. That's not me. I don't have my doctorate. They're not going to want me. Like, I'm totally woefully unqualified for this. And my friend, her name is actually Emancipatory. I hope she's listening. She was like, I'm going to text you every hour on the hour until you apply for this job. And it was the last day. I was on the organ bench playing for my church job and all that. Buzz, 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 buzz. And I was like, finally, okay, I'll just throw in an application. And the application was an interview, then it was an audition, then it was a follow-up interview and audition, and the rest was history. And so now it's been almost a decade that I've been here at the choir school, and I love it. It is extremely rewarding. We have an intergenerational choir. We serve predominantly Black and Brown students. So the choir is about 60 folks, half students, half adults. And so I have like an intensive program for students, a lot of wraparound social services to make sure that they are really being fully served, and not just in music, but in academic enrichment, with life skills, food nutrition, things like that. We do a lot of that with our families. Have a meal with us every day. We do a lot of advising, college prep. So it's a really intensive program, and they're with us for a long time. Like, so many of them are with us for 5 or 6 or longer. We have people who are with us for 8 years, 10 years, 7 all the way through graduating. So it's really intensive. And then there are adults who mentor the kids, and they will sing alongside with them, help with Spanish, French, math at the same time. And so it's a really unique community. And there are just very few communities like this in the country. And so I just feel fortunate and lucky and humbled every day to kind of do this job.
This is an amazing story. Like, thank you for sharing your story.
Happy to, thank you.
This is beautiful. Okay, first follow-up question.
Yeah.
Are you now utilizing your, quote, what we're calling informal training? Are you seeing that change who you are as an educator? How is that now infiltrated now that you've had the formal training? How do you see that informal training playing out?
I think I'm extremely aware of it. I do a lot of encouraging. I encourage a lot of our kids. The majority of our kids are Black and from Black communities and are really involved with their churches. So I am definitely drawing upon that. I think it is a great opportunity for, I don't think it should be thought of as formal or informal. It's more like familiar and unfamiliar starting places. And so I like to think of it as cultural scaffolding. So we know what scaffolding is when we are teaching, right? It's like, okay, like if we have a complex equation in math, we're not going to just start at the end. We're going to like, okay, here's addition, here's subtraction, and we add these blocks until we're able to do this full thing. That's scaffolding. We break it down and we chunk it. And cultural scaffolding is when we start from a familiar place that someone knows culturally. So let's say I'm teaching, we do like a Bach cantata every year. It's really important to who we are. I I choose intentionally a lot of the cantus firmus cantatas where the trebles are kind of just floating on the chorale tune over the top, which allows our young singers to sing back. And then our older kids and adults can do the really crazy polyphony in the alto, tenor, and bass parts, right? And I can have everyone singing together. But I need these nice floaty head tones, that kind of classic children's choir hooty tone that we all love. But how do I get there, particularly from students who might not have ever heard something like this before, maybe didn't have training like that, might not have music at all in their school. So where I would start is like singing something like Kurt Franklin's Revolution, which was this great tune. It's like, do you want a revolution? Whoop, whoop, right? And then when we do the whoop, whoop, we're getting into head voice, right? And then I just start working that head voice there, and then elongating durations, and then we're ready to do a cantus firmus. So that's an example of cultural scaffolding. And so trying to start from one place and taking it from somewhere else. The other thing that I've learned is to really focus on rhythm. So one thing about a lot of traditions that are not Western is that there's a stronger emphasis on rhythm. And so we start a lot of times with rhythm syllables, with experiential kinesthetic feeling of rhythm. And that's a big thing for us. And a lot of times I'll just drop a beat over something and we'll, line it up, take that beat away, and then here we go. We've got this beautiful cantata. And so that's one way that I absolutely use that cultural scaffolding approach. And it's something that is important to me because as a child, I felt like I was like I had like multiple personality disorder, right? Like I didn't know who I was. I had these two different parts of myself that could not be unified and could not be reconciled. So I was at church and there was a way to sing at church. And then when I was in the children's course, there was a way to sing at the children's course. Both are wonderful and both are great, but I didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it and to talk about those differences. So when I was growing up and, people would come over and I was like, oh, play the piano, sing a song, do the thing. You perform all the time and people come over. Sometimes I would do like songs from church, but I would sing them in a different style. And we didn't really have a way to like talk about that. So we would say, oh, sing it Peabody style. And that was the way to say using head voice, using this, because we didn't know how to describe this thing. And that was what we called it, until I was in college. It was just like sing it Peabody style. Like that's how they do it at Peabody. Like that's how it's done. And so it was fine and great and wonderful. But now I want my kids to be able to identify, like, no, we're using chest voice, we're using middle voice, we're using mixed voice, we're using head voice, this is modal voice. What do these things mean? And how do I use these in different contexts? And I always like to tell my students, they know there is no pitch that we sing that is 100% absent of TA action of chest voice, right? Even if we take it all the way up, it's just different amounts of it. And same, and so it's important. It's all great and it's important, and our kids are able to talk about that and to kind of navigate those passaggi areas. And I have them map out like, where do I change from head to chest, in their scores, and we kind of plan it and then we'll try it at different places. And it really helps them to retain who they are as individuals, to retain their culture. I believe that chest voice is wonderful and great and rich, and we should use it. And I think that head voice is wonderful and great and rich, and we should use it. And so making sure that they have those experiences that are just really fully integrated into what we offer is a big part of what we do.
This is beautiful, using this idea of cultural scaffolding from Kurt Franklin to just the Peabody sound, and how you're empowering your students with not just incredible vocal technique, but to retain individuality and to have the vocabulary to talk about it. What a cool concept. Yeah. All right, I think this is a great segue into telling us about your TED Talk.
Yes.
You also turned it into a chapter in a GIA book, but it's called, and I quote, "The Gang Mentality of Choirs." how choirs have the capacity to change lives. Can you tell us a little bit about this and kind of relate it to our conversation?
So I absolutely love this. And this is something that I feel like I should, pull back out again, because I think that a lot of our choral community was not really ready for it. Back in 2015 was when I was really beginning this thought and wanting to re-envision what the construct of choir can and should look like. But the principle is this, I grew up in the city and, I observed a lot, and I knew people who were involved in gangs and all of that. And I've always known intrinsically why people, join gangs. It's because they want to be a part of something. It's because they need protection, all those sorts of things. And then when I was older, I was in a psychology class, and we were learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I was like, this is why people join gangs. This is exactly why people join gangs, because it offers all of these essential needs that we need to really be fully what we call self-actualized people. So, and maybe we can get a pyramid to show folks or something in the liner notes.
Yeah, I'll link it in the notes.
At the bottom of the pyramid, we have like physiological needs. So things that our bodies need: air, shelter, water, those kinds of things. Then we have this next need for safety and security. It's exactly what it sounds like. Then we have social needs for friendship, relationships, family, those sorts of things. And there's esteem. So, and that's self-esteem, right? We're talking about confidence. How do we view ourselves? How do we view achievement? And then we take that all the way up to the pinnacle, which is like self-actualization, where we can really truly be creative, problem solving, where there's authenticity to our being and spontaneity, right? And so I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly why people join gangs. And that's actually the same reason why people join choirs, right? Because we can, and we do offer all of those, except we're not necessarily as intentional as we should be. So choirs can actually learn a lot from the construct of gangs, right? And how they retain people and how they make people feel this sense of security. Of course, we don't want any of the other, parts of gangs that are not constructive, but there is something there to learn, right? There is something there to learn about caring for people. There is something to learn about bringing individuals into one family. And I think that is really important. And then in choir, I, started thinking, oh yeah, that's what we can and should be doing with choir. I think that every choir is an opportunity to really champion the wellness of humans, right? That's what, we teach music, we conduct music, but really we're trying to care for, tend for, humanity. That's what we're doing. And music is how we do that. And so, I believe, and it is our belief here at the choir school, that we've got to take care of those physical needs. So we're going to make sure people have clothes. We make sure, we intervene a lot with many of our families that might have financial distress, how am I going to keep the lights on? You need food? Great. We're going to line you up with some programs. We have a wellness program, a nutrition program, all of those things. Safety and security. We make sure our space is safe. We make sure it's psychologically safe. We make sure, of course, it's physically safe, and that is very clear. We take care of a lot of social needs. We have a lot of time for connecting that is not music making, right? And sometimes I think that's the biggest mistake. Even if it's only 5 minutes in a rehearsal, we should take some time to build community with one another. And I know it's hard because we're always trying to prepare, but I think it pays dividends. But we pay attention to that. We have mentoring, we have group mentoring, we have one-on-one mentoring. That's where that intergenerational part is really important to our model. Having students age 7 all the way up to adults at age 77, it's really important to fulfill those social needs. And then for esteem, we're building people up. We are making sure they feel confident. We have what we call standards, and they can earn standards over the course of the year, building up our community, making them feel great, making sure they feel successful. And then self-actualization. Who are you as an artist? What do you prefer? What pieces would you like to see and why? Where, a lot of democratic processes of like, where is the zenith of this phrase? Where is the pinnacle of this? How might we do this? Can you sing that phrase for me? Ooh, you see what, Tanisha sang? Can we all sing that like Tanisha? Great, right? That's beginning the process of self-actualization. And that's wonderful. And then we're really nurturing the artist citizen, which is what we're really looking to do. And I think it's important. I think it's just absolutely important. And I think ultimately that's how we build. It's one of the ways that we build an emancipatory choral education. And I think that's really, really important. And I use that word intentionally. So scholar Geneva Gay says that, a choral education should be multidimensional. It should be transformative. And she has these great lists of just like powerful adjectives. And she ends with saying that an education should ultimately be emancipatory. And I think that is just so powerful, and it reverberates. It is like fire shut up in my bones. That's what we would say. Whenever I hear that, it just gets me so excited, because that's the opportunity that we have. That's the responsibility that we have. And so I just think it's great. How do we make our choral education emancipatory?
Oh, that's a beautiful quote in and of itself. I'll make sure I write that down. You've given us some great examples of how you're tossing in opportunities for democratic education and empowering that self-actualization. What are some of the ways that you build that connectivity? You said it just takes like 5 minutes, but what are some of those examples as well, since that's a really big part of this?
Right. So we have a lot more than 5 minutes just because of the way that our program is designed. So for us, there is, we have mentors, and there's an actual Think Big Brother, Big Sisters kind of programs within our choir, which is super helpful. We have activities for the kids to get to know one another, for the adults to get to know each other. I incorporate games. Like even if we're doing something that you might think is elementary, like pass the beat around the room or forbidden pattern, I'm going to pull everybody into that. Whether you're 7 or whether you're 77, we're all going to do it together. When we're touring together, we build those common experiences with folks. So it's those are the kind of interactions that we like to do. Special dinners out, going to a museum, lots of just a concert, together, going to things together. It's just great, playing board games, checkers together. During non-COVID times, we have these community dinners together. So, it's just stuff like that really builds into the community, which ultimately satisfy those really critical social needs.
It's the intentionality of it all.
Yes.
You're doing things intentionally. You're picking cantus firmus cantatas intentionally.
Correct.
Setting them up and everything you've talked about is so intentional and so thoughtful from such a place, like you said, we have the responsibility to create this emancipation culture, which is beautifully said. It also lends me to ask the question, where did your website name come from? Your website is Equity Sings, and I feel like it's going to come out of this somewhere. But where did that come from?
So I've been doing this work for a while. By this work, I mean ADEI, Access, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion work for a long time. And a few years back, I was just kind of like, oh, Arreon, like consulting for a long time. And finally, I was, thinking, well, it needs a name. And I was thinking, as this practice continues to grow, having some, other people assist me in it, like it can't be my name, right? It needs to be bigger than that. And I was just like, well, what is important? And I was helping mostly at that time core organizations. And I was like, well, what is important about this work? And I was like, I don't know, equity is not something that is a responsibility. It's a privilege and a joy, like singing. Equity sings. And that's how it came to be.
Equity is a privilege and a joy. Wow. Can you unpack that just a little further?
Yeah, so I think it's a privilege for us to do this work because it's not everyone. I take it like, a lot of people are like, oh, yeah. We're doing this equity work. It should have been done a long time ago. Absolutely. But I also realized, particularly with the movement in the United States and a lot of Western countries, it is still a privilege that we have these tools and resources to be able to move forward this conversation. There are so many places in the world that are so authoritarian, that have such dire situations that these conversations cannot even be held openly. And then I think it's a joy because what we forget oftentimes is we get out of it that which we put in. Mm. And if we go about doing this work joyfully, we will reap joy out of it. And seeing someone else's success is joyful. Mm-hmm. Seeing someone else's access is joyful. And anyone who I've ever spoken with who is truly engaged in this work for the right reasons, it's been a great experience. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable, but it is always a joy. It's always rewarding. It's just the best. And so I think that we sometimes forget that. And one thing I love about this one piece, It Takes a Village by Joan Shimko. It's like, it sets the proverb, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And then, which is this West African proverb. And then she continues it. Everyone must share the burden. Everyone will share the joy. And I say that all the time. And I say that to a lot of our supporters and volunteers. And that's community building. Mm-hmm. That's community building, right? We all will share the burden and we all will share the joy.
How full circle. And what a great example. I'm now thinking, hey.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a great piece.
Yeah.
You mentioned ADEI, but you also talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and I love this choice of word, belonging, DEIB. Yes. Can you kind of explain the difference, ADEI versus DEIB? How did you come about that acronym?
Yes. So I like a lot of these are beginning to grow and develop and evolve. And before we were talking about ADEI, it was really DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And before that, let's like take this from the top, right? So we used to have outside of Jim Crow came the civil rights movement, and we were looking for equality, right? Then that movement really slowed down a bit with equality, in the 60s and into the early 70s. And then we moved into this era in the 80s that was tolerance. So you might remember tolerance. I remember when I was in school, we were like, oh, let's talk about tolerance. We should be tolerant. And now that feels like really cringeworthy, hearing it like, oh yeah, you should tolerate someone else who's in your space and in your world. It just doesn't feel right. And then we kind of moved later into the 90s and the early kind of 2000s into diversity. And then kind of inclusion was there. And then we really evolved into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's where things were for a while. And that was still a major step forward in our understanding of this work. But when you have those things, you have belonging. And ultimately, people will not belong if they don't, if there's not diversity and they don't see themselves reflected, if there are not equitable policies and practices. And to break that down, meaning that equitable policies and practices, meaning that we're giving everyone the resources that they need to have equal success. So equity and equality, two different things, but we're giving everyone the resources that they need, which might be different for each person, so that they can have an equal outcome, right? And then inclusion, like how are we bringing in different thoughts, ideas, perspectives, cultural traditions, and all of that. And when that is present, we have this sense of belonging. Then in my practice, I've started using ADEI over the last couple of years, and I hope that everyone checks out in March, the March-April Choral Journal article, because I go into this pretty extensively, and I talk about why I have been in the diversity initiatives at the American Choral Directors Association, why we're now using ADEI, and we actually are using ADEI-BR. Right? So, and I'll go through all of that, but we are continuing to expand our understanding of what is needed. And so just like we have we had like GBL at one time was gay, bi, and lesbian. And then we went to like LGB, and then we had LGBT, then we had LGBTQ, then we had LGBTQI, now we're at LGBTQIA+, right? Yes. And I love the plus because it's a great acknowledgement that there's still more for us to understand and to learn. And similarly with this practice of like, inclusion work, I believe that the ordering of things is truly DEIBR. That's access, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And then the R is restorative practice. So I'll say that one more time. So that's access, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and then the R, restorative practice. So the reason why the A is first is because you cannot have any of the other things unless you have access, period. Mm-hmm. If you can run the best program, you can be the most like woke people on the earth, but if you don't have this access, then the rest of it's for naught. If people don't have access to your organization, then it will not be diverse. If you do not have access in your organization, then there's no need for equitable policies, right? Because you don't need to appropriate a different amount of resources to have an equal outcome, right? Without access, there's no need to include differing ideas and perspectives and all of those cultural traditions and the other things we're talking about. And without access, no one's going to feel like they belong.
Right.
And that's really important. And so I think this is the correct order. Access, you provide access to your organization. Once you have access in your organization, you'll begin to see more diversity. Because you have that diversity, you need to make sure you have equitable policies. Even if you don't have that diversity, but you're like, I value diversity, then you should have equitable, practices. And then inclusion. How am I seeking out different perspectives and ideas and cultures and cultural traditions to be in our space? Right? And then that leads to belonging, right? Feeling like this is my place, feeling like there is space for me, feeling like there is space for this person, feeling like, that this is a place where I am safe and comfortable and wanted and loved. And so that's important. And then there's this R. And this R I've been really underscoring recently, restorative practice. So most of us know about restorative justice, or I've heard maybe a little bit about it, particularly school teachers. You're like, oh yeah, we're gonna have a restorative circle. Like, this kid did something to the other kid. And so we're all gonna get a circle and we're gonna talk about it. And that's like a restorative circle, But the idea of restorative justice is that in the criminal justice system is where this kind of was used. And it basically is there's been some offense, and that not only does that offense need to be acknowledged, but we need to repair what has to happen before. It's not just about justice, like you were right, you were wrong, someone said you were wrong, and you go off and you have a consequence, but it's like we've actually started repairing and healing. And that's where this comes from. And there are a lot of just really public examples recently of folks who have said, I don't want that person, after this kind of restorative practice has been used, as restorative justice has been used, with, the offender and maybe a victim's family coming together, having conversations and bringing about healing. And these are beautiful and wonderful stories. And this is starting to happen more frequently. Then this moved over to, well, how can we use this principle in schools and in our lives when, like Susie hit Jerry, how do we do it, right? And then that's kind of how we got to restorative justice. but I like to use restorative practice. And I was really doing a lot of research into where did this restorative stuff come from? And it really comes from, we find it in continental Africa and a lot of cultural traditions in continental Africa. And we also find it in indigenous cultures. And a lot of Maori culture particularly have really complex systems of restorative, what they don't call justice, but really practice. And I love that idea of restorative practice because we don't have to have an offense for us to know and acknowledge that healing is needed, that there is inherent brokenness in our world that we seek to address, to acknowledge, to address, and to redress. And that's what I love. So it's not just that we do this work, not just that we have more diverse repertoire. It's not just that we have a more culturally responsive pedagogy. It's not just that we have a more culturally responsive practice, but how are we leaving things better than what we found it? And so Rick Biella from Texas Tech says that, and he has said that with many of his choirs, and he worked with one of the ensembles that I was singing at during my graduate school days at Delaware. And he just would say this, and he said multiple times when he was visiting, the goal is to leave it better than you found it, meaning the world, right? We've got to leave this world better than what we found it. That is restorative practice. How do we, if we're reaching out to communities and we say we want to engage them and we want to bring them into the fold, how do we leave these communities more whole than where we initially met them? So that, I think, is at the pinnacle. That's when we're really self-actualizing together, right? And we're getting to the top of that pyramid together. And so I keep talking about that restorative practice. It's like, if we're going to be doing, this diverse repertoire and these sorts of things, what are we doing with those communities that have, been othered or marginalized or excluded? Great. We sang some pieces. Great. We did some study, but how are we actually going to leave these communities better in the end? And so that's something that I sit with often is, how can we really have restorative practice?
You've given us like a step-by-step what to do action-wise. You've laid out the research. You've talked about Maslow. You've given us the pyramid. You've talked about the gang mentality of choirs. But through all of it, we now have a step-by-step process with ADEIBR on how we can sequentially look at our programs and what we're doing to reach that ultimate, the top of the pyramid, the R. That is so beautiful. I love your explanation. That's the best explanation that I have heard. Yeah, I mean, wow, I'm sitting here taking notes like a crazy person, learning so much from you.
Well, it's my pleasure to share. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh. Well, I don't want to go yet because I have a few more questions if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So you were a thriving consultant, both to choirs in so many ways, but also to nonprofit organizations, and you do all sorts of studies and strategic planning and board governance. Can you talk to us about that aspect of your job and how you see that impacting your choral world?
Yes, I've learned so much over the years. So I've now worked with, I'm about to engage with my 70th organization.
Whoa, 70th!
It's so crazy. But I've learned so much. So, I really started out very choral specific, and then other kind of music organizations started seeking out some, guidance and help in this area. And then, you guys know, with my role at the Choir School as the Director of Music and Operations, that's just a fancy word for artistic and executive director. You do all the things. So I learned a lot about fundraising. I've learned a lot about, capital campaigns, strategic planning. I've learned about all these things, and I began to share, how do we do that with this lens of equity? And then that's why people began to engage with, we're like, hey, Arreon, I'd really love to engage equity things, because it's like, this needs to be woven into what we're doing. And so I've been fortunate enough to lead a number of longitudinal studies with large organizations, taking a look at their trends of inclusion and diversity and seeing how it's been growing. I've helped people develop dashboards, tools to be able to track their progress. I've worked for corporations to help them, in hiring practices with ERGs, those are employee resource groups. How do we create affinity groups? Maybe it might be the AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, ERG, to really talk about the unique, experiences of folks from our AAPI community or our Black community or millennial community or, and, designing those sorts of things and seeing what the impact is on retention, seeing what the impact is on innovation. And there are a lot of tools to be able to measure those sorts of things. And it's so rewarding to see like all of this graphed and plotted out, because what you begin to understand is that ADBER is not just a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. If we want to be sustainable nonprofits and businesses, and we want to grow our profits, and we want to be leading in innovation and creativity, well, we have to have a diversity of people and perspectives and ideas and cultural traditions, because that is necessary. That's the secret sauce. That's the secret sauce, right, of success, is the diversity of perspective that we can have in our planning and our idea incubation. And so I've loved doing that kind of work. I've also been doing a lot of policy kind of work, with like organizational policy. Also working with a lot of foundations who are looking at how they can more equitably distribute their assets. So I love that. Doing advising. I did advising with the Biden-Harris transition team, which was really cool, and with the National Endowment for the Arts, and how there's some new programs, which I hope people check out. Deadlines are approaching. But it's been really a joy. As I said, it's a work, it's a burden, but we all share the burden, we all share the joy, right?
Right.
But it's just been really rich, and I just am grateful that people have entrusted me with their stories and vulnerabilities and their challenges and their successes. It's certainly overwhelming and rewarding.
So with 70 different businesses, and obviously there's going to be more in your future, for someone listening that's wanting to really get started using this lens of equity and employing what we've learned from ADEIBR, what would be the first steps? What advice would you give them to get started?
My first step is, I always tell people, more and more education. So I actually have developed a framework, and I'll share it with you, which is called a Levers of Change framework. And this is in businesses and things like that. But the first step is education. You've got to do whatever you can to educate yourself, seek out resources, do all of that work to really learn, right? Just jump into the deep end of the pool, learn before you start to do. Right? Learn before doing. So what I always think the order of things is, we start with learning. And then after we've done some learning, we go into a leading phase. And in that leading phase, we make a commitment that we're going to do this. And we really take leadership. That's what leadership really is. It's commitment in action. And so that is the next phase. It's not something that we're broadcasting yet and doing all of that, but we are making a commitment. We're writing it down. We're saying within our organizations, we're going to do 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. How do we get there? And then you're like, I think this is what we have, and this is what we don't have. And then you move into this next step called involving. And that's when you begin to involve others. A lot of people want to start the process by like, let me talk to all of my friends who are diverse. But no, that's the third step. Third step, right? And in that involving step, that's when you talk to people who have been maybe othered or historically marginalized. And you bring them into the fold and say, hey, I'm working on this. Am I on the right track? So whenever you ask people's advice, you have to do something with it. One of the most harmful things we can do is ask for advice and then not take any pieces of it, right? That's not good. That's not good, right? So not only do you want to involve people, but you want to give them agency and you want to act on that advice. Once you've done that, you're ready to communicate to your community. Look, we're going to be doing something differently. Here's why we're doing it. That's when you're coming out with statements, right? Everyone likes to start with a statement, but no, that's like halfway through this cycle. And then after you communicate what you want to do, you start measuring. you want to use both quantitative and qualitative techniques to measure. So how many, what's the depth, what's the experience, surveying, looking at engagement. Engagement might be how many hours people are participating. It's not just about how many people, but the depth of which people are engaging with your organization, your course, your business, et cetera. And then you go into this sustaining phase where you're like, how do we do? Do I need to make some course adjustments? You acknowledge, I keep using that word acknowledge. If there are shortcomings, right, you might be like, okay, we have to make these course corrections. And then with those course corrections, that's going to require more education. And that's where you began the cycle. And then you go right back through it again. So I can give you a visualization of this cycle.
Yes, I would love
but
to
it's
link that.
really, really important, right? It's so important, this cycle, this levers of change. And this is how we get leverage and how we can move through efficiently, effectively, and with respect with our peers. And so that's how I would kind of encourage people to think about their initiatives as they are planning them. And where do I begin? Education.
Oh, which is perfect. Podcasting is educating. I'm so thankful that you had time for this.
I've
taken a whole steno pad of notes.
I'm so glad that we did
This is wonderful. Okay, before I let you go, we always have the guest share the one thing that really matters, like the nugget you want them to walk away with. So what do you want the listener to really remember from this?
Wow. The one nugget, I guess I would say, is nobody's perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to slip up. We fall short, right? We all do. And that's okay. What matters is that we're getting back up and that we're committed to the work. More than anything, people can see if you are committed to the work. So consistently ask yourself, how can I show that I'm committed to this work in action? How can I show that? And I think that's the most important thing, is like a lot of the stuff, you might not start there. You might not do things, in the right order or sequence, but people will know if you are genuine about this. People will know if you're doing this for the right reasons and that you have a personal commitment. The big nugget I would say is that commitment has to be a personal commitment. It cannot be an organizational commitment until all of those individuals have a personal commitment. Otherwise, it's just checking boxes, right? So how do we get to that place where everyone has a personal commitment? And then we'll be successful.
Belonging. I love it. Belonging and restorative practice. Finding that. Oh, this is so good. I have a million ideas for titles, but this has been such a lovely conversation. Okay. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. It's been great.
Leadership is commitment in action. We have so many powerful keys to make change, but it starts with accessibility. It's okay. Keep trying. As you heard him say, get up and just keep going. I really want to hear what you got from this episode. I can't thank Arreon enough for being on the show. If you want to be a part of the conversation when we unpack this episode and many others, check us out at patreon.com/musicedmatters. Every single penny that goes to there supports more guests on the show, supports keeping this show alive, and I thank you so much for your support. Y'all, you matter. We all know that music matters, especially accessibility, diversity, equality, inclusion, belonging, and restorative practice. Let's get after it, y'all. I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters podcast.